sitting in this wonderful courtyard in Alcos. I was actually heading to the business meeting upstairs in a coffee shop, and I ended up here, just sitting here, absorbing, looking around, resetting my nervous system. I've got a few minutes left, and I'm looking at, obviously there's a lot of reference to history, to the cultural context, in the way the architecture is laid out in certain elements, the floor, the different textures of the floor, different textures of windows, obviously mashrabiyah, oriental lamps, certain colors like olive color, for example. It's a strong reference to the historical context of the region. And the way people engage with the space as well is just like something that you would see in a touristy spot in Italy, in Tuscany, for example. But it's not a historical spot, as in it's not coming from the past. It's a modern spot which was built I need to double check that, but I would imagine a few decades ago. Maybe even it's much more modern, but it does look like it's been weared out a little. So I'm thinking, what is the difference between how we experience historical touristy spots like that? I wouldn't say touristy, but let's say historical spots that's got a certain layer to it, or a few layers, that's being obviously well maintained, taken care of, and it does attract people for coffees, for breakfast, for different concept stores inside, just like here. So it's not just a pure historical spot, but also something that's been adapted to the modern lifestyle. And what's the difference between this type of a space and the space that we are in now? I think it all lies in how we experience, how we interact with the space, of course. And from that, obviously flows an argument that it's important to strategize the presence of specific stores, restaurants, cafes, whatever you place in a space like that. You have to be very careful about it, because that will then influence the way we interact with the space. If it's only stores, for example, that's obviously more commercial, so people would come to the spot just to observe the surroundings and potentially to buy something. If there's cafes and restaurants, also depends on the style of a cafe and restaurant. If it's a more casual one, people can just casually come in and have breakfast and really be part of the space, rather than feel like they've come for something formal, they've come for something, that they need to kind of prepare themselves for. So there's so much detail that goes into how we interact with the space that can be thought through. There's definitely a huge part that's natural, you cannot control everything, you cannot strategize everything, and you should not try to do that, of course. There's different magic that happens just on its own, and we shouldn't be aiming to control that. But you can definitely control certain elements that will then create this magic. I've actually covered this topic before on chronotype in a different video, of how space and time interact with each other, and the magic that they create, the unique combination that they create, is not something that we can fully strategize, but we can definitely think of the details that then will encourage, help, and influence this magic that's created between those elements. And the interaction between time and space is the main energy that you feel when you're part of a specific space. So let me just summarize a few other main points that make the space feel especially alive, especially real and natural, and really something that's part of the bigger picture, rather than just a standalone, cool, glamorous project that's made to entertain and, invite tourists. So first of all, as I said, it's all about the interaction. It's a very specific word, I say, interaction, the way people interact with the space. Not just the audience, but also the people that work here, the people that come here for like a short-term work, some employees that are helping some maintenance fixes, all the partners, all the stakeholders. But actually interaction means a lot of different themes. Surprise, surprise. And the word interaction, the concept of interaction, can help us explore deeper flows within it and really understand the logic, the magic, the strategy of space, and the narratives about it. So that was interaction, and I've obviously touched on that before, but other points that I didn't touch on, and I might do it in other videos. So second is my favorite, becoming, the theme of becoming, and from that actually flows Another main point, probably I'd say one of the most influential ones, and that's the sense of incompletion, the sense of openness. So the space is still evolving. It's not because it's incomplete and it will be complete at some point. It's because it's taking form with people that are part of the space. It can be being part of the space for 10 minutes. It can be being part of the space for longer. It's not just about the people, but generally about different flows that go into the space. So it's all about the feeling when you enter the space that it's not polished, complete product, but it's something, that lives, that's got its own rules, that's got its own rhythms, and those rhythms can change. And generally, there's lots of natural sync. Hello again. I just got back home from the space where I was at the beginning of the video. I had a meeting there and I was just sitting, absorbing, watching, thinking just a little bit to a certain extent about different things related to the space. And I mentioned the topic of becoming there. And I thought it's a great opportunity to actually elaborate on that because I literally have an article on that on my Substack, which is called Becoming as a Strategy for Everyday Life, which directly talks about how brands can incorporate the process of becoming, the narrative of becoming, but also, as usually, and the main purpose of this platform is to showcase how brand strategy, brand narratives can be embedded into real life. Whenever I dive into brand strategy theories, not specifically related to branding, but for example, on urbanism, on architecture, on sociology, something that would help me understand the field, the psychology within this field, and many other elements that are not directly related to the narrative but influence it directly. So the more I do that, the more I understand how everything is interconnected. Yeah, let's talk about becoming. I'm not going to draw direct links to real life in this video, but every strategy that I'm going to mention, every tactic is highly applicable to real life. Everyone is going through the process of becoming in different ways, forms, stages of life. Again, let's not philosophize it too much, but let's just say that this is one of the truths that's there in the world, and something that has to be acknowledged and probably thought about just a little bit. So let's think about just a little bit. So in terms of the region of GCC, the process, the concept of becoming is not just something that's there as part of our lives, both everyday life, philosophical conversation, commercial processes, but it's a narrative that's now being actively brought up in a public discourse, starting from the art events like Art Basel in Doha, like Diriyah Contemporary in Saudi Arabia, Art Cairo in Egypt. And obviously when certain major art events like those cover certain topics, that just means that they reflect what's happening in everyday conversations, in mundane life. So not just at the high level of looking at life, but actually something that people are living through. People, commercial sectors, governmental segments. And I'm sure that everyone who either knows something about the Middle East and GCC specifically, and people especially that live here in the region, they do feel this concept of becoming, process of becoming, taking different forms. So it's not just from art events, but I also hear those conversations every day. I see brands incorporate them or trying to incorporate them. Sometimes they feel that this is the narrative, but they can't really translate it fully to everyday tactics for the brand, especially when it comes to the space, because it's not as obvious as it might seem. Becoming equals incompletion. It's not that simple. It's not that direct. There's more flows, undercurrents happening inside. And obviously, if we look at external factors like economies in transition, rapid urban development, high migration, that all makes sense. So it's not just something philosophical and intangible that we see happening around us, but it's something that's caused by very specific factors, and that we can also link back to very specific factors when we try to strategize this process of becoming. I also looked at the concept of becoming in my research paper, which I've done for my master's at King's College London, where I was looking at the new forms of cultural heritage in the UAE, arguing that certain modern architectural and development projects can already be called cultural heritage for the way they shape perception and for the way they introduce new definitions. In that paper, I was looking at three main social pillars: identity, community, and time. And some of the narratives that I found out through the analysis of big data, through deep interviews, was the concept of becoming. Let me just literally read the excerpt from the article that I put about my research on the concept of becoming. Just quickly. Drawing on three social pillars that allow us to see things from diverse perspectives: identity, community, and time, the research combined in-depth interviews with big data analysis. For example, what became clear is that new identities in new communities are anchored in ambition, in becoming. Regional vision statements, such as Dubai Vision 2040, embed a sense of anticipation into collective identity, and there is a remarkable willingness among people to look toward the future together and to actively build it. So that's something that I've touched on in my paper, and actually I think I should dedicate a separate video to my paper. I've done a talk with the Bioculture Authority on this paper. There's some interesting, unique insights that not just brands would benefit from, but also us, just people, residents of the UAE, if we want to understand not just the world around us, not just the city that we live in better, but also ourselves. Why are we here? What drew us here? It's not just external commercial factors. Spoiler, there's a lot of interesting undercurrents that we had inside us happening when making decisions to move. So yeah, but let's now look at three main pillars, at three main bullet points, which I think are essential for brands to consider when integrating the process of becoming, the narrative of becoming. So first of all, start with the basic. The grammar book of every strategy is the audience. We really need to understand our audience much deeper than just understanding what they do for a living, what they dream about, what the goals are, how they interact with others. It's really about going beyond that, and in our case, we can look at what becoming means for them. What are the patterns of them going through becoming? How was it before in the past? How is it now when they tend to interact with our product, with the space? How it's going to be in the future? We can also predict that looking at the patterns in the past, at the patterns now, and generally looking at the specific audience profile and how they would tend to look at those processes. So basically, you cannot obviously analyze every angle of the audience, right? But beyond some basic things that you need to do, depending on the context, we always have to choose an angle, a bit of a more unique angle, something that you would spend more time on, something that you would need to approach with a lot of intelligence, especially if you're doing interviews. You have to ask the right questions, sometimes not direct questions, not like, how do you approach the process of becoming? How do you usually cope with that? Something much more thought through that would definitely, first of all, make a person feel safe to answer it, and second of all, of course, will lead us to the right answers, not just yes or no, not just white and black, but something that would have different colors and shades to it, so we can work with it in our strategy. Second thing is introducing rituals to the space, turning transitions into rituals. One of my favorite social theories that I use a lot at work is Bauman's theory on liquid identity, which argues that modern identities of modern people are always liquid, always changing, always flexible, always moving, always in transition, always flowing. I do know a lot of synonyms for this word, but the point is that before, even 50 years ago, we would have quite strict labels, social roles. Now those roles and labels are, first of all, increasing in number, and second of all, just the borders of those labels start to dissolve a little. So it's not that easy to identify when one label finishes and another label starts, when one social role finishes and another social role starts. One of the main examples of that would be just the increased number of entrepreneurs that don't really look at working hours. Well, they of course look at working hours, but they don't really live by 9 to 5 standards of working. And it's usually a certain passion, certain mission behind creating a product, which means that it's coming from the inside. It's coming from the reasons beyond the commercial ones only. It's embedding into their life naturally, blending other fields of life into one. I moved the camera a little, I hope you don't mind. So yes, in order to minimize the problems that might arise from always flowing identities, we need to introduce certain rituals. And my point about becoming as an everyday strategy is about introducing certain rituals into everyday lives. That's how we make becoming, first of all, more tangible, more conscious, I would even say, but second of all, also acknowledging the process of becoming within our people. So they feel that they're understood, they feel that they're supported in their process, and that the spaces that they're at, things that they buy, the products that they interact with, they're all designed to support natural processes that happen in the life of our audience. For example, becoming. And the last point, the one that I find one of the most interesting ones, and also the point that I'm going to elaborate on much more than the previous ones, and it's working with time, with the concept of time. And again, I hope you allow me to read a bit of my article. Think about time carefully. How does your audience experience it? How is it translated? What are the different time flows you can integrate? It can go as deep as frameworks and theories on time within space, on the spirit of space. That's what I did in my latest project on a cultural cluster. That was a few months ago. I've dived into a huge number of papers. I only had 2 days to do that, so it wasn't a crazy maniac research. I roughly knew what I was looking for because that was a strategy set up before. We had to do the preliminary interviews, preliminary strategy research, so that then we can understand the scope of the research, of the deeper research that we were to undertake. I dived into proper papers on the spirit of space, such as those by Mikhail Bakhtin. Remember this name, I'm going to talk about him a bit more later. Hartmut Rosa and Zygmunt Bauman. I've just mentioned Bauman on liquid identities. It is not as academic as it might seem. They all eventually resulted in clear slides analyzing how different cities and communities experience time, with a clear understanding of which points connect with our audience. Yes, it was literally 5 slides. We were researching about a specific city that was growing in tourism, that was growing in popularity. It was a very interesting city with very deep historical roots, trying to also modernize some aspects, but the identity itself was not fully formed yet. However, we could feel that that people across the country were drawn to the city. There was something that would just attract them. There was something within the residents that would keep them in the city, although it was not a capital. Moreover, it had quite a difficult, complicated geographical location, and it was quite an interesting dynamics. And we were trying to understand what are those intangible processes happening in the city that really draw people and also make people stay. So in my article, I touch on different theories. I focus on, for example, Henri Lefebvre, of course, discussing linear space and cyclical space, that there's different rhythms of time. They should either not contradict each other or complement each other. Again, there should be a specific thought put into those interactions. However, now I would only want to focus on Mikhail Bakhtin's chronotype theory. If you want to have a look at a few interesting words about other theories that could be applied to how you use time and space and with brands, you could have a look at my article on Substack. I will attach a link under the video. That actually feels very interesting to say this phrase. I don't think I've ever properly said that. I was never a blogger like that. So yeah, Mikhail Bakhtin, I use his theory of chronotype a lot because it opens up opportunities for other subtopics as well. So chronotype is a theory that basically emphasizes time and space. So it's always about temporal and spatial relationship. Mikhail Bakhtin started looking at literature with that theory. However, this was then adopted, reimagined into other fields as well, and I use it a lot with narrative. So an important topic that's flowing from this theory is the interaction between time and space and where the meanings really happen. So if we look at the concept of becoming, the processes of becoming, where does this becoming really happen? When is it complete? When is it felt? When is it conscious? And so looking at Bakhtin's theories and then applying it to other branches as well, we realize that it's not throughout the space where the becoming really is felt, but it's through the specific interaction of time and space. That's when the meaning is created. So while you cannot really strategize and analyze how this specific interaction is going to happen, how time and space are going to blend together and create a unique combination that will then give a space its signature narrative, but we can analyze, prepare, strategize little details that go into both time and space. So when we look with a specific narrative, when we look with complex pictures that go into branding, we really have to look at two concepts. And it's not just about development, architecture, and urban planning. It can be related to every other brand, especially if you've got a physical presence, if you're a store, retail. Of course, it's hospitality, any kind of physical product, digital as well. It's a bit more complicated because then time and space in digital realm take slightly other transformed forms, and maybe I'll do a video on that as well. So, on that note, I will leave you to think about Mikhail Bakhtin and Louis Lefebvre. If you don't want to think about them, if you want to have a look at certain words about those theories that can be instantly applicable to your branding, marketing, to the processes that are happening around your brand, but also to the processes that are happening in your real life, because once again, I will say that again and many, many times, the theories that I'm talking about that I relate to brands, they're directly related to our real lives, and that's why I'm making those arguments specifically. That's why I'm drawing those conclusions, because those are the ones that are especially relevant for what happens in our lives in other fields as well. So if you want to have a look at certain words, you can just go to my Substack and read a few articles of mine. I try to be as simple with my words as possible, but also, of course, to give as many insights as possible and also encourage people to think about other things to inspire them. Thank you so much for listening to this video. I've got a few hours of work to do tonight. It's 7 p.m. I need to write a lot today. There's different processes happening in branding, and writing is a huge part of it, especially if you don't have a copywriter on the project. You really need to sit down and think of every single word that goes into how the brand speaks. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I guess stay tuned. Another phrase that I never said before, but there's a first time for everything.